Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Seidenberg Conversation Series. I'm Jonathan Hill, Dean of the Seidenberg School, and thank you so much for joining us today for what I think is going to be a really monumental discussion on the key lessons coming out of this the pandemic and this unprecedented experience. To guide us, we have a stellar lineup of diverse industry leaders here who represent the biopharma, healthcare, and legal fields. And we'll ask each of them to share their perspective on this crisis response and management of the pandemic and insights into overcoming this crisis and preparing for the next. We have been in uncharted waters for the last 14 months. And as we begin to see spring coming and hope on the horizon, this is the time to capture the lessons that we've learned during this really unprecedented experience. And we have three amazing people who are going to talk with us today about it. It is my honor and privilege first to introduce Georgia Keresty. I'm proud to say that Georgia is a PACE alum who is an independent board director for public and private companies and an advisor serving the pharmaceutical and technology industries. Most recently, she led Takeda Pharmaceuticals as the Chief Operating Officer for R&D. In her role, she has direct oversight of the R&D integration for the Shire acquisition, portfolio strategy, and management of governance forums and Takeda's regional development centers in Zurich, Osaka, and Shanghai. George is a member of the board of directors for Solid Biosciences, Aspen Technology, commissioning agents, and serves on the board of trustees for Clarkson University. This month, Georgia joined the board of directors for Intellia Therapeutics. As impressively, Georgia has a diverse and far-reaching educational background, earning several degrees at the bachelor's, master's, and PhD level, one of which is a master's in information systems at Pace University. Next, please welcome our dear friend, Daniel Barchi. Daniel is Group Senior Vice President and Chief Information Officer of New York Presbyterian. We're also proud to call Daniel one of our own here at PACE, as he's a valued member of the Seidenberg School Advisory Board. At NYP, Daniel oversees the strategic vision and management of information technology, innovation, analytics, artificial intelligence, telemedicine, and pharmacy. Daniel holds a Bachelor of Science from the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis and a Master of Engineering Management from Old Dominion University. He served as a brigade commander while at the U.S. Naval Academy and was twice awarded the Navy Commendation Medal for superior leadership. And please welcome our third panelist, Heather Schneider. Heather is also part of the PACE family as a graduate and serves on the Seidenberg School's Advisory Board. Heather holds a master's in computer science from PACE and a Juris Doctor from Columbia Law School. Heather is a partner in the intellectual property department at Wilkie Farr and Gallagher. Her practice focuses on patient litigation, antitrust issues associated with licensing, mergers, and bankruptcy. Heather is second vice president on the board of the New York Intellectual Property Law Association. Prior to law school, Heather worked as a senior technical consultant for Hewlett-Packard. She is co-author of the book Mobile Applications, Architecture, Design, and Development, and many of her clients are, in fact, in the pharmaceutical industry. So thank you so much, panelists, for joining us today. And if I can begin by stating the obvious, we are in unprecedented times. The pandemic has drastically changed our world. It's cost us too many lives, livelihoods, our sense of security. With so much on the line, it's absolutely critical that we have conversations like this one as a community to share and take stock of our experiences and challenges. And we need to learn from them so that we can be and do better for one another, which makes us even more grateful to you all for making the time to be with us today. So our first question to start our conversation. As COVID-19 began to rapidly spread across the globe in early 2020, can each of you share your initial experience at that time? Do you recall how your respective organizations and industry verticals viewed this emerging pandemic? And with all of the incomplete information, sort of like driving in the fog, and so much unknown at the time, what do you recall your perceptions were? Daniel, can you start with us?
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks to you and to Pace University and the Seidenberg School for putting this together. Thinking back 14, 15 months ago, general awareness at the end of 2019 going into 2020 that something serious was happening in Wuhan, but not being able to pick that out from what was happening with SARS and other viruses globally up to that point. I personally thought that it would address itself and not be a global concern. My first experience with it was that Wuhan and some ports in China were shut down, and I was concerned about getting electronic equipment out, but still not thinking about the impact in North America. In my mind, it started getting serious when we heard what was happening in Europe, and particularly in Italy. And that's when we really swung into action and started looking at the modeling and thinking, what is this going to do to healthcare in North America? And my analytics team was instrumental to our preparation here at New York Presbyterian and modeling data. And it's interesting, we were pulling data from every source we could, from the CDC, from the WHO, from the New York Times, and putting them all into models and trying to expect what might happen here. And it was scary and sobering. I'm glad to say that our models were conservative in that they predicted very bad, and instead we just got bad. And nonetheless, at the worst of it, we had more than 2,500 patients in our hospitals who were COVID positive, with more than 700 on ICUs. But that preparation allowed us to do what was necessary, which was turn our operating theaters into 2- and 3-bedded ICUs, turn some of our cafeterias into med-surg space, and generally order as much as equipment as we could. It was fascinating. We stayed days and weeks ahead of it, but only days and weeks ahead of it. And I'm glad that we were not in a point where we were ever restricting care. The last point I'll make here, and this is one of those lessons learned, and I applied it to a broader approach too. You know, when I was hearing about what was happening in Italy and people were dying because they didn't have enough ICU beds, I thought, this is in northern Italy. You know, Switzerland is only about 30 miles north, and France is about 50 miles west. Why are they running out of equipment? Why aren't they taking advantage of a broader region? And I think this is something that we need to think more of in North America. When we've got a crisis, we can't think only about what we have, you know, at our own hospital site or university or city. We need to think regionally and statewide and even nationally. And I think if we approached more of the thinking that way, we would have been in a better spot, even as we got through the first wave of the pandemic.
Wow, yeah, that's an amazing perspective, Daniel. Thank you for sharing that. And Georgia, you know, from you're in a different perspective. You know, you're I suppose looking at this impending thing and the risk and the demands on your own business. What do you recall from that time as this information began to flow in?
Yeah, no, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Daniel, because there's some of the same things for the pharmaceutical industry that Daniel described. Now, for myself, I was responsible at Takeda for all product and drug development outside the US. And I'll never forget that day, second week in January, when I got a call from my head of development in Shanghai, who said, there is a significant medical issue that's emerging. And what should we do? And first thing we did was we needed to ensure the safety of our own employees and ensure the safety of the thousands of patients on clinical trial that we're responsible for. And so the immediate triage was just for China. But we soon came to realize next, our team in Osaka were dealing with the same thing. And as we began to triage now the next country and where our employees were and where our patients were, we quickly began to realize we have to put on our global hat for this. We can't just do this country by country. So the effort with the team from Japan and the team from China was, how could we prepare for the rest of the world? And honestly, for the pharmaceutical industry, that's a bit of a reverse, where we would typically use Europe and the US to think about how we could support the rest of the world, but this was in reverse. And we put a few things in place, such as negotiating with the health authorities who are our partner in protecting the public health. We negotiated with them to have medicines delivered to a patient's home, so they didn't have to leave to go to a trial site to get their clinical trial medication. We agreed with the health authority how best to document issues that may have come up at our trial site so we wouldn't violate good clinical practice. And those things that were put in place for our teams in China and Japan, we easily then transferred to our teams throughout Europe and then ultimately to the United States. And so we were able to leverage our global footprint. We were able to leverage focusing on keeping our employees and our 20,000+ patients on trial safe, but ensuring that we could provide a broader perspective as a pharmaceutical company. Second was recognizing that there was already some understanding of what this pandemic could be from our learning in the early 2000s with MERS and SARS. The focus was, are there any currently available medications that could be repurposed? Is there work that was already done through clinical trials that we could use to maybe make drugs available immediately for people who have come down with COVID? So there were a number of things that were being done in parallel. First and foremost, safety of employees and patients had to be put first. And it was a very proud moment when our China and Japan team said that they could lead the rest of the world's response for Takeda, which was a reversal.
Wow, that's engineering hope in the midst of this overwhelming situation. And I'm really taken by Daniel being charged with this local response, but thinking globally about it. And you being charged with this global response, but also in turn thinking locally about it. And I think about Heather, and lawyers are risk managers among other things. And so, you, like everyone, you're getting bombarded with information, but you've got this client portfolio that's pharma and tech and science. So, you're having to deal with the legal concerns of this diverse group of people. So how did that unfold for you, Heather?
Yeah, it was really interesting. And to some extent, I have all this pharma experience, but also my experience was a lot just like your kind of average office worker in New York, where things moved so quickly there in March. I had been hearing about it through clients, friends, and families and other places, but everything came to a head. Our last day in the office was March 13th. And that week literally went from, we're organizing some events and, other things. I was in the midst of organizing a big black tie event at a hotel to, oh my gosh, there's a lawyer in New Rochelle who has COVID, to it's coming to New York a lot, to our IT staff making plans for us all to work from home. And on the day of Friday, that 13th, which I always remember, we were taking home laptops. They gave us, Cisco phones for our house, so that like you can just call my office number and I'm here at home. But they said, you may come in next week. And over the weekend, we learned that at least one person in our New York office was positive, and they told us just to stay home. So it really was, and by the 20th, I think there was a wider lockdown in New York. So for myself and a lot of office workers in New York, there was this really key period right there in the middle of March that went from 0 to like lockdown. Very quickly. And as a manager, not only were we dealing with clients and telling them we were working from home, but I'm in charge of the employees in my department, making sure they're happy and healthy, that they're not freaking out, frankly. And it was really our IT staff. We have an excellent IT staff at my firm. We've done talks with Pace before about legal tech, and I know Jonathan knows the head of technology at my firm. And they really, saved our bacon. We've been able to talk to clients seamlessly during this whole time, and frankly, not really miss a beat because of the risk management and disaster planning that our IT team had in place. So it only reiterates for PACE graduates from Seidenberg and any other school how important that role really can be.
Wow, thank you, Heather, for sharing that. And I'm going to ask a very obvious question, but I think your responses will certainly be different than mine would be. And Georgia first, and then Daniel. What was different about this? I mean, we've grown up hearing about virus outbreaks, and frankly, due to the quality of the products that Georgia, your team develops, and Daniel, your team administers, we've largely, we don't worry about, hadn't worried about plagues anymore. There were sensationalist banners about Ebola and SARS and different new viruses emerging, but like killer bees, we sort of dismissed them. So from your personal and professional perspectives, what was different about this than other prior health crises?
I think there were a few things. First, I already alluded to, this was global. This truly was something that, as Heather described, went from 0 to 100, it seemed like in a very short period of time. But other things that were very different was the role of social media, very, very different in terms of sharing of information, misinformation, and how that could impact someone's decisions, someone's response. And I did see that very differently in the COVID epidemic and pandemic than in prior public health crises. Also, the mobilization of not just the pharmaceutical industry, but every single facet of American and global life, the mobilization that took place. First, to look for a possible way to prevent, to assist when patients do present with COVID. That was an amazing mobilization of the healthcare industry and the partnership that takes place. Also, all of this was happening in parallel. We were still learning about COVID while we were trying to help patients, while we were trying to mobilize, while we were trying to get the right information out so people could make the best decisions for themselves, whether it was to self-quarantine, not to travel. So there were many things that happened in parallel, and some of them were really to an extent that we've never seen before, especially how social media influenced the spread of information and misinformation.
Wow, very interesting. And Daniel, you are an incredibly busy person with a massive set of responsibilities. What changed for you in this environment?
Sure. Well, you said in your question, Jonathan, that it seems like an obvious question, but it forces you to think differently. The obvious piece to me was the size and the scope of this. If you think about our fellow Americans and people around the world who've died or been had their health impacted by this, that's certainly sobering. But in the healthcare industry, we prepare for things that are hours-long events, like a mass shooting or a catastrophe in a city, or days-long events like a power outage or a huge snowstorm, or if we're really thinking long-term,
Wow.
What if our supply of fuel oil is back up for our generators is cut off and we don't have power in our hospital for 48 hours? And those are the type of enterprise risks that we focused on before. And I think that good leaders run their organization, really outstanding leaders think about the strategy, and the best of leadership has both the goods and the bads in mind at all times. And it's really good at enterprise risk management. And I'm sure Georgia sees this in a lot of her board and governance roles as well. And as great as we had been at New York Presbyterian on enterprise risk management, this is just not something we had prepared for, the size and the scope of this. To think that we were working the phones until 3 in the morning, calling friends from 20 years ago that we think work in the airline industry to try to get PPE in from China. You know, these are the questions that now we've learned, and we certainly need to diversify our supply chain, but that we were in this spot is stunning. And independent of the pathology and human cost of this horrible, horrible plague, it's our ability to respond that I think has been most interesting to watch develop. And this is where we're focused on going forward. So whether it's a plague or something else, we're not in this spot again.
No, Daniel, I just want to tag on to one thing you said, because a lot of the enterprise risk management plans did have pandemic, but it was the pandemic for someone else, not for yourself and not for the whole country. And so you're absolutely right there.
Yeah. And, you know, I think you bring up some things that I think we used to worry about, mass injuries from an event here in the city. And, you know, we're now worrying about mass contagion and, you know, talking about supply chains and the fact that not only could you not get toilet paper, but there were food things you couldn't find in stores, which is not something American consumers have had to experience in a very, very long time. So to ask in academic speech, where did we screw up? Was it, were there preventable things that maybe we could have built into the system so that it wouldn't have been such a shock? And was there a better way to coordinate the response locally and internationally that might have saved lives and prevented the shock from being so extreme? And I'd ask you, Daniel, first.
Thanks for asking, because I'm going to use the only good answers, and I didn't want Heather or George to answer first, and I'd have to think of another one. Maybe it took something like this, as horrible as it is, to force us to think this way. And I was thinking earlier about wars. And if you think about a global war like World War II, as horrible as it was as a cost to humanity, the ways that battlefield medicine and medicine advanced, that equity and equality in the workspace for people of all genders back in the home front changed, that integration of troops from a race basis that hadn't happened before changed. And so it was the situation and the demand that caused us to give up the ways that we had always done. And without something like a war, maybe we wouldn't have made that advance. I'm not sure that there would have been a triggering event that would have caused us to question, why do we practice medicine like this? Why do we do mass transportation like this? Why do we put people at risks in a concert hall sitting close to one another like this? And things that look strange to us when we see video of 3 years from now, or 3 years ago, that maybe we won't operate in the future. So I don't know, Jonathan, the answer to your question, other than maybe this was the event that will cause us to question everything that we did. And I'll add one caveat before I wrap up. I remember reading a book, I think it was called The Great Plague or The Great Pandemic, probably about 10, 15 years ago. And it was about the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920. I read it purely from a historical perspective, thinking like, well, that could never happen. And I'm sure that there were many, many lessons learned from that. And I'm not sure we were applying any of them in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, even 10 years ago. So in many ways, we reverted to our old ways as a society after World War II. We can't let that happen after something like this.
And I actually have something that ties into that. Well, Daniel, about, like you mentioned, something bad happens, like a war, but you change your thinking because of it. We ironically, about 2 years ago, I guess it was I don't remember, 2019 now, a helicopter hit our building in Midtown Manhattan, our law firm's building. It was 787 7th. It was a foggy day. It was an accident. And of course, everybody in the building was very upset because we didn't know what was going on. We had to evacuate through the stairs. Ironically, and we were out of our office for like 2 days, right? It's like you said, you were used to, so we had our great disaster response plan to cover us for 2 days. What happened after that, though, is not just our firm, but all the tenants in our building, which is a bunch of law firms and banks and everything, started working with management to have a better disaster response plan, because frankly, our evacuation from the building was a mess, frankly. And so we were actually very not lucky, because we wouldn't want it to happen again, but we took that bad scenario and the frankly poor way that it had been handled to some extent, and really learned from that. And ironically, it's that extra disaster response we put in place for that got ourselves and everybody in our building very well situated for this longer event. But you're right, we had a plan in place for 48 hours, seemed like a long time, like for us to be, the longest conceivable time we could be out of our office without power. And so and now we're in just a whole different mode.
Yeah. And Georgia, your perspective, of course, from the pharmaceutical industry, but you serve on a lot of corporate boards. You talk to a lot of people. What do you see from this perspective in terms of where we screwed up and where maybe what we can fix so it doesn't happen again?
I think there's two things, and it's so much easier to plan and be confident with short-term planning, but that longer-term planning is a little less precise. It's sometimes scary. It may highlight weaknesses that you don't want to show, and so from a governance point of view, really challenging now that long-term planning, because that's where we may need to have more investment, different kind of investment. And so that tug between short-term delivery, meeting short-term financial goals versus true longer-term planning, I think that's an opportunity from a governance point of view. Okay. But we can also look at this in terms of what did we do in this time, like Heather and Daniel talked about, that can now position us to be better going forward. And I'll give you one example from the pharmaceutical industry. And that was when you look across the entire industry and look at how many patients were on clinical trial. And when you're on clinical trial, the company that's running the trial has a responsibility for and to that patient. And when we think about what we did to maintain those patients on trial, ensure that they could continue to receive their medicine, it now may give us a different way to run clinical trials in the future. Okay. And what that does for us is it could expand the diversity within our clinical trials, because we could now run trials in places where we may not have been able to. We may be able to execute them in ways that maybe the health authority didn't agree to in the past. But now we've shown that we can work in this way, that they could be successful. So let's take advantage of that, work within the existing framework, diversify and bring more diversity to our clinical trials. And we could see that as a win-win from this pandemic.
I have a follow-on question that's a bit out of order, and it's really for you, Georgia and Heather. The development of this vaccine was much faster than anyone predicted. And of course, it was computer modeling that aided that. That's my little plug for computing and technology in today's talk. But how's that going to impact? How's that going to change the pharmaceutical industry? How does that change the intellectual property practice for pharmaceuticals? You first, Georgia.
Let me start by adding one more thing to the computer modeling, and that is in the last 2 decades, anytime there was a global epidemic or pandemic, work had been started, whether it was with Ebola, whether it was with Zika, or with SARS and MERS. Work had already been started. How quickly we could repurpose and leverage that work to accelerate was important, and having the necessary data infrastructure in order to do that was key. And again, this is my own perspective, having been in this industry for 37 years. The role that the health authorities play, whether it's FDA or health authorities in every country around the world, they in no way compromised on putting patient safety first. ensuring the safety and efficacy of those products. Maybe the pathway was different. Maybe the development was done utilizing modeling, utilizing prior work. But I think the industry and the health authorities, with that common goal of protecting the public health, I think demonstrated that maybe for the next breakthrough cancer therapy or cure for AIDS should be able to take an accelerated pathway to product approval.
That's very encouraging.
I think that's a great point. And it was interesting working with clients across so many sectors. It was like at the beginning of the pandemic, we were working with people who were trying to get PPE made and trying to maybe retool factories that did other things to make PPE. Then we had the assays, people trying, clients and other people trying to get, rapid response tests and other things. And frankly, just even get enough of the materials and reagents and other things that are used in tests, even have them widely distributed. Then there was, meanwhile, the vaccine development going on, particularly the messenger RNA vaccines from Moderna and Pfizer. As well as we had clients, I worked on a collaboration with a company that had been looking at one of its older drugs that had been used for some respiratory issues and figure out how it might be applicable to COVID and try to get emergency use authorization for that. So there were almost like these different phases going on from just the initial PPE and tests to the more advanced vaccines. One thing I think interesting about IP is there's a lot of debate going on now, sort of in government and in the op-ed pages of a lot of the papers about whether we should relax IP protection for some of the vaccines and things. And I actually think, I personally think at the moment, it's not really IP that's keeping vaccines from being broadly distributed. I think it literally is, bottlenecks in terms of manufacturing and other things. And I do worry a little bit, the pendulum is always swinging back and forth in this country between IP protection. And you worry that if you get rid of IP protection, you might get a lot more distribution of something now, but then people might not have an incentive to make something in the future. So it's always a matter of finding that balance. But I think this next year or so, patent and IP reform is perennially discussed in Congress. And I think you'll be seeing a lot more of that in the near term. So it'll be interesting as an IP lawyer to follow all of that for ourselves and our clients.
Interesting, and another set of challenges. Next question I have is, dear attendees, you'll have a chance to ask questions pretty soon here. But I know certainly from my position managing my small team of people and faculty and staff and students here, there were a lot of stresses placed on people, and when our organizations are all made up of people, and I'm curious to know about the challenges that your organizations face, and also your industry verticals. We all talk to our peers in our respective industries, and just in terms of helping people cope through this really, really challenging time. Daniel, can you talk a little bit about New York Presbyterian's experience and leading the response and the healthcare front? Because your folks are really there on the front line, and a lot of attention. I think people understood that you and your colleagues were putting yourselves in harm's way. You talk to us a little bit about managing through the unknown.
Sure. Thanks for asking, Jonathan. We're a 11 hospital health system. We're the teaching hospital for Columbia and Weill Cornell. Our physicians and nurses deliver great medicine. But at the end of the day, we're a people organization. It's the people who make it happen. We've got 45,000 employees. And I think we were well situated going into this because we had been people focused. I was speaking with our daughter last night, and she was asking about how we're addressing issues like anti-Asian and Pacific Islander hate and bias right now. And I talked about everything that we were doing, town hall meetings, lectures, support, training. And then I pointed out that, we were doing the same thing last year when we were all as a nation struggling to improve ourselves through the Black Lives Matter movement. But I also pointed out that we were doing the same thing in 2019. So I was heartened to remember that in 2019, we had outside speakers and education and seminars to make us think about all of our colleagues and empathy and being actively anti-biased, anti-racist. And this was in 2019, before everything that happened to us as a nation in 2020. And so I say all that to say that we've been focused on people and our perceptions and supporting one another for a long period of time. And that was important because when COVID hit, it was all hands on deck. We were asking a lot of all of our clinicians. We used phrases like redeploy, and redeploy meant you are maybe a nurse in a dermatology practice, but now you're in an ICU unit at 3 a.m. You used to be a hand surgeon, but now you are, doing respiratory therapy clinics for COVID patients. And then for my own technology team, many of our team members went from writing software, supporting technology, to being in clinical units, either as runners or we were supplying equipment, people working in the morgue, people supporting our vaccination, running our 3,000 person a day vaccination site. And these are IT people and analysts. So we asked a lot of everybody, but we were open and transparent about what we were doing. We gave all of the support that we could. We communicated, and by saying communicating, our CEO and COO had us set up functionally a television studio in one of our boardrooms where they would broadcast on almost a daily basis in the height of the crisis, a 10 to 15 minute message update, full transparency about what was going well, what was not, where we stood. They would send out messages. We would have town halls. They virtually rounded, literally, and when they couldn't get out and go to every one of our units because it simply wasn't safe. People would walk around with iPads with the CEO on the iPad, and the CEO is walking around through an iPad, meeting people, asking how things are going. And so, as tough as this was from a clinical crisis, from a patient care perspective, in terms of the people who cared day in and day out, it was giving them all of the tools and the support and the communications and the information and being transparent about it that I think really won the day.
Having had the honor and privilege of connecting with you from time to time, it's stellar work. A lot of people I don't think could have held up under that pressure, Daniel, but you and your team have done just signature work, and I hope you are properly recognized for that, and that the things that you've done will become common practice and in healthcare. And Georgia, on your end, I mean, the incredible pressure that was placed on your industry, certainly by governments, but just, public outcry, really could be overwhelming for a lot of folks. So, how did you keep your team moving in the face of this overwhelming pressure?
The interesting thing is we felt we had 5,000 Takeda R&D colleagues around the world, 4,000 right in Boston. That's where we have our largest footprint. And we felt that if we enabled each employee to help solve the problems we needed to solve, it would be a much better solution. For example, 2/3 of our R&D colleagues, they can't work at home. They work in laboratories, in pilot plants. They have to come in. They're in blood collection centers and things like that. And so rather than folks who don't have that requirement to come in, rather than us trying to put the framework in place for their workday, we let them define their workday. How best would that definition of what your workday is, how could that enable you to do what you need to, but also feel that you have some controls, feel that you could stay safe, to stay protected, and also not make it feel as if we have a group of haves. You can work at home, and have-nots. You can't work at home. And so here's some of the amazing things that our lab and pilot plant folks came up with. They came in and they said, look, rather than 5 days a week coming in on the first shift, if you think about it, there are 7 days in a week, 3 shifts in a day. we have 21 shifts to work with around the course of the week. It would be better for me to come in on second shift. That means my kids have care at home. I don't have to take public transportation during the peak of commuting times, and we let them construct their day that best met the needs of their personal life and the needs of the company. And they were just awesome in terms of ideas they came up with. And I can honestly say that they felt as if they made a contribution to the industry and to helping the industry address COVID, but also had some control of how they could manage their personal life. And that was a learning for us, since so many times, you know, you have the message from the top coming down, and maybe we're going to do things differently going forward in terms of, you know, the folks who worked in the laboratories and the pilot plants and the essential workers knew best what they needed to do to accomplish both. And that was an important learning for us.
Yeah, that's quite inspirational, George. Actually, I'm taking notes here as you all speak because I want to use all of this stuff as much as I can. You know, Heather, your clients come to you for protection, right? And all of this stuff is happening. And, you know, you've talked about how your IT team really facilitated the ability for everyone to do remote work and stay productive and efficient and in communication. As this stuff is unfolding and your clients are trying to be responsive to the pandemic and you know, keep their businesses running, you know, were there regulatory challenges that you had to deal with? Were there government initiatives that might have you know, had an impact on or a delay on what they were trying to do? How did you protect your clientele in this crazy time?
I think that's a great question, Jonathan. And I think what was going really well, actually, is the different regulatory organizations like the FDA were working very closely with clients, and people were doing a lot to get emergency use authorizations and get those much more widespread than at least I could think of in any previous time, to get things. So, for example, the vaccines that are out now, like Pfizer and Moderna, for example, are not like fully FDA approved yet. They're under emergency use authorizations, but then they're working to get full FDA approval. And I think that whole framework being in place had been used in the past, you know, for, you know, occasional, like maybe something for Ebola or Zika or something like that. But to see that emergency use authorization procedure really be used for so many things, I think was great. And then I actually think that the whole pandemic, you know, much like we talked about learning from adversity, has really affected our relationship with our clients. Much like all of us here now are seeing each other's bedrooms and homes and kids and dogs, it's been like that with our clients, frankly. You know, I used to have a lot of clients I spoke to by phone, and then maybe every now and then we'd get together for in-person meetings or hearings or whatever. Now we have much more frequent conversations, not always 9 to 5. Because frankly, to George's point, I have some clients who would much rather speak at 7 or 8 o'clock at night after their kids are in bed than from 9 to 5. And we talk over Zoom in a way that's frankly, you know, more personal than some of our prior interactions. Yeah. So I think we've all been making sort of the best of that. And I think some of that, it will be interesting to see in the future. How much do clients want to pay me to go somewhere and take a deposition if I can do it by Zoom? I don't know. You know, there's pros and cons both ways, but I think we've learned there are some options people didn't, you know, even think of before. You would have never had a court hearing or a deposition by Zoom. And now that people have seen it works, maybe we'll do it in the future. At least we have that choice. So I think it's really changed those kind of relationships.
Yeah, you know, and that's going to be interesting how our style of work has changed. And I don't want to get to that point yet. I'm hoping we'll have a few minutes to talk about that. But if I want to beat the business professors to the punch and do a case study, write one up and get it published before they do, what are some of the successes from your respective vantage points? What places, companies, people, states, government entities have done a really effective job that you've seen over the last 14 months? Are there some folks that stand out to you, Daniel?
I'll start with government and speak broadly, and I'll frame it though by sharing something that my wife told me. You know, I work in healthcare. We all know what an MRI is. It's a, you know, internal imaging study. But she also taught me to use the phrase MRI, most respectful interpretation. So when you see somebody doing something and it seems silly to you, what's the most respectful interpretation for what they're trying to do? Maybe they had an intention that's not panning out, but they're trying to do the right thing. And so no matter good or bad, everybody, companies, businesses, governments, I'm sure has been trying to do the right thing. Some things have panned out, some haven't. I read a fascinating op-ed in the New York Times about a month ago by Paul Krugman, and it was about risk, and I'm returning to enterprise risk. And the subject was why policymakers in Europe are concerned about the wrong risks. And he was using the example of the speed of vaccine rollout in North America versus in Europe. And you know, if you give credit to the US federal government, it was for investing early and hard in vaccines. And Georgia would probably have good insight about this piece, irrespective about whether they were going to work or not. We weren't positive how it was going to turn out, but darn if we weren't going to invest in it. So when we knew, we would have a lot on hand. And Paul Krugman pointed out that in Europe, they were concerned about being cheated about pricing. And so they were all about negotiating the contracts for the vaccines instead of going big and investing in them. So that was one of the examples where everybody's trying to do the right thing, but at some time there are risks that are really not even concerning relative to the bigger picture. And I think that the government's response to investing in vaccines variably across the globe is one of those. And then I would say that variably in certain cities and states, you know, New York Presbyterian had a good partner in New York City and in New York State getting us the vaccine, but getting it into the hands of everybody in every state has been a challenge as well. But again, I would respond, Jonathan, that I think everybody was trying to do the right thing, but we've all been variably successfully. And I'm sure that Heather and Georgia would say, as I would, that's true even in our own organizations.
Georgia, what would you say?
No, I'm going to just further something that Daniel said in terms of taking something we already knew and making sure we applied it in the best way. We already knew that from a vaccine manufacturing point of view, we have to do that almost a year before we need that vaccine. That's why you always hear for this year, the vaccine for the flu is only 70 or 60% effective because we had to start manufacturing it last year and we guessed at what the strains would be. I'm simplifying it. And so there was a mobilization of manufacturing capacity to start manufacturing with the absolute understanding that, you know, this is the shot we're taking because if it doesn't fail, but it's a shot worth taking because we know enough. Vaccine manufacturing and vaccines have been around for a long time. They've been the greatest public health tool that we have. It was absolutely a good risk to take. But the other thing that we tend to think overlook when we think about essential workers is all of those non-healthcare essential workers. People who ensured that there was, at least in the states that require someone to pump gas, like New Jersey, there was someone there to pump your gas and someone there to ensure that your grocery store was open and that the essential healthcare workers could stop for a cup of coffee or delivered food to where the triage was taking place. So there, in my mind, is this, I don't want to say forgotten, but maybe less recognized group of essential workers who, without those workers, the mobilization would have been, you know, just, it would have fallen way short from a community point of view. And really, those essential workers are community focused. They are delivering your Amazon package in your community. They're, you know, running third shift on Dunkin' Donuts in your community. And so, you know, I think it's those two things: the recognition that we already knew that we had to take this shot at manufacturing well before we had all the final pieces in place. And And it is paying off. And also, when we talk about essential workers, we always think, rightly so, of healthcare related essential workers. And when this is all said and done, that non-healthcare related essential worker played just as an important role to enable every single person to live as close to a normal life as possible here in the US.
Yeah, so important to remember those folks, and it's sadly easy to forget that if they had not been willing to expose themselves, that we would not have been able to do what you all did to make this better. And how about you, Heather? What are the points of light that you saw coming out of this?
I think one, and this also goes back to something Daniel mentioned, was transparency. I was very proud of my law firm for the sort of programming we did during the pandemic, as well as getting a weekly message from the two co-chairs of our firm. And Daniel mentioned something similar that the leaders of his company were doing. And I think this is a point you can take for whatever kind of business or team you're managing. People will put up with a lot if they feel like they're being told the truth and that they're in it together. And I think some of this is also driven by younger people. I think years ago, Wall Street type law firms probably didn't, spend a lot of time telling their employees what they were doing behind the scenes or what they were doing to help Black Lives Matter, to stop Asian violence, or to do other things. But now young people expect that from law firms and other companies. And I think it helps everyone be a bigger team. So I think even if some of the news is bad, being upfront and transparent with people will help you in whatever business you're in.
Yeah, I think that's stellar advice about being upfront and open. Controversy about the vaccines. Johnson & Johnson got pulled, and I saw a statistic, I don't know whether it's true or not, but that the blood clot possibility with birth control pills is 1 in 1,000, and the blood clot incidence with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was 1 in 1,000,000. Daniel, you've been right there, literally in the vaccination centers. What's your takeaway from that process, and people that question whether or not they should get vaccinated, and which of the which we know the Takeda products are our favorite, but which of the vaccines they should steer themselves towards? Do you have any lessons and advice you'd extend on that?
So I'll start by saying I'm not a physician, so I'm not going to give any medical advice. And I'll reiterate the most respectful interpretation piece about the decision makers who had to make the call on Johnson & Johnson. You pointed out the numbers, Jonathan. As I understand them, 6 people with blood clots and about 6.8 million vaccinations. And there were certainly trade-offs about whether to stop, how long to stop, when to restart. At the end of the day, I think everybody would say that our goal as a nation and as a globe is to get everybody vaccinated, whatever vaccine you can get. I'm heartened by the amount that we are vaccinating, 3.5 going to 4.5 as a record. I think it was set last Saturday, 4.5 million vaccinations in a single day. Just fascinating to me. Something we should be proud of and focused on, not only for North America, but for the globe. A vaccinated person here in North America is fine, but if in Asia or Africa, where the positivity rates are quite low right now, but if somebody's not vaccinated there and a strain mutates and comes back to North America, that's a concern. And personally, I'm concerned about the length and longevity of the capability of these vaccines. They started off as being 90 days. I think it was recently extended to 6 months, but this is where we as a society are going to need to think about the future. But I'd wrap up by saying that we're in a fortunate spot that we will likely soon have more vaccine than we have people ready to be vaccinated. Then our question is, what do we do as a society about that? And then how do we work with nations and other societies around the world to get everybody vaccinated across the globe?
And again, such an impressive thought process of thinking, locally at, 48th, from 48th and Lex to around the world. And, Georgia, this is your business. And I guess my question is, my fear is we're going to open up on September 1st, like the good old days at Pace University and other offices and institutions around the country. And then, I always worry about the headlines in the New York Post, and of course, not the physical paper anymore, but the tweet that says, new strain. The Babylonian strain is here in New York, and everybody needs to wear a triple mask and get home. How do you see this unfolding in the next 18 months to 3 years?
Yeah, and again, I absolutely agree with Daniel's assessment, and I will disclose I worked for 16 years at J&J, and many of the folks working on the vaccine, supporting the vaccine, manufacturing the vaccine are longtime colleagues of mine. And someone said to me, I bet the folks at J&J are furious. They're not. They're absolutely not, because if additional review needs to be done, putting the patient first is the absolute right thing to do. And they'll partner with CDC and FDA in order to do that necessary review and share the results of that. So it's a matter of doing what's right for the patient. That's the first thing. I'm not an MD, and if there's anyone who has any doubt or maybe has prior medical issues or concerns, they should be discussing that with their physician in terms of what might be the best vaccine for them. If there is a difference, they would be in a better position to describe that. But what I will say, and I know I had mentioned this already, I am absolutely confident that the standards that the FDA used and every health authority around the world, the standards that they used to grant emergency use authorization or the full approval, which will be coming, have not been compromised in any way. If anything, there's been a stronger partnership between health authorities with industry in order to hasten the process, not cut corners. I'm confident of that.
Yeah, that's very encouraging to hear, Georgia. Thank you. And I do want to take some time, or allow some time for our brilliant students to ask some questions. And Ashley, I believe you have a question.
Hi, yes, I do. My question for the panelists is, in what ways have you managed your mental health, and how have you helped your peers manage theirs as well?
I'll say something. Oh yeah, I was going to say,
Heather, go ahead.
That's a great question, first of all, and I think we've been very tuned to it at my office. People are facing different mental health problems during this time, and I think the fact that we're frankly talking about it is a step in the right direction. We have people at work who've had serious deaths in the family. We have people at work who are working from home all day with their kids. We have people who are at work who are working at home all day alone. We've really been vamping up our sort of employee assistance program that we have at the law firm, and sort of frequently reminding people of it. I myself have been trying to stay in regular touch with my doctors and things like that. But I think it's just one of the best things that we're all talking about it, and making sure that we show our employees that we do care about their mental health. Yeah.
Let me add that going back to something I talked about in terms of having the employees tell us what you need. Tell us what you need during these unsettled times. And honestly, what someone in the US may need is very different than someone in Japan or someone in China or someone in Switzerland. And so as a company, Takeda put together a set of benefits that, with our best understanding, were things that would facilitate these unsettled times, would help from a mental health point of view. But if there's something that you need that wasn't on that list, let us know and we'll work with you. We'll work with you, whether it was extended childcare benefits or extended telehealth benefits. And so, from an employee point of view, it was important for people to feel that they could confidentially bring forward what they needed. So providing that confidential avenue and that trust. but then as a company, ensuring that we weren't responding to what we thought they needed, but to what they were actually telling us. And again, it was very different around the world because governments responded differently. So we try to complement country by country what each government was providing, what we could provide, and we listened a lot, and there was a lot of coming together of employees and supervisors and colleagues, because you had to trust one another to share some of the more personal and difficult information in order for you to move forward.
Ashley, I'm glad you asked this question because it's germane to all of us in academia and healthcare, in the legal profession, everywhere. One of the challenges we have right now is that because we're on Zoom all the time, we're on Zoom all the time. So it's easy to schedule that 6:30 a.m. meeting or that 7:30 p.m. meeting. And we're really struggling as an institution to say, although it's possible, it's not what we want to do. We need to be more respectful of people's time. So that's one of the things that we're working on. Our leaders have done a remarkable job. My boss, our chief operating officer, has just been great in saying, like, people have to take their PTO. So we're tracking the time off, the leave and vacation hours people have, and saying, if you haven't taken your time off, I'm going to make you take it. In the next 6 weeks, tell me the days that you're going to be off. And that's been really empowering and helpful to make us take a break from what's going on. So I think that was great leadership from the top of our organization. And then personally, it just happened that I began 2020 before we even knew that the pandemic was going to hit us. I had a goal of running a certain number of miles in the year that it required running a lot every day. And I was so fortunate because it was an escape for me personally. And so I'd get home 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night and go out and run the streets of Manhattan, which were absolutely deserted. And I ran in neighborhoods that I'd never run before because there was no traffic or cars. And I could run down the middle of 7th Avenue in a neighborhood that I hadn't been in before. Normally I run in Central Park because it's easy, but I didn't even have to look left or right to see if a car was coming. So it was fascinating, and it was a great escape listening to books that had nothing to do with the pandemic and just running for exercise.
Daniel, you bring up an important point because you mentioned Zoom, and just as a bit of a red flag, we even changed some of the wording. We didn't say work at home, we said living at work. I can't do that call because I'm already living at work, meaning, you've moved your work area into your home area. So it's all these little, living at work as opposed to working at home. It was just little coping mechanisms that gave people, in a fun way, the ability to kind of raise the red flag and say, nope, that's living at work. Okay, so we get it.
Wow.
Ashley, thank you for the question.
Thank you.
It's a fabulous question. Thank you, Ashley. And Peter, I believe you have a question.
I was. I had actually asked two questions. First one was, how can we use the uncertainty that the pandemic brought to advance ourselves personally and professionally?
I'll jump in here. Actually, I'll point out the downside. When you're not with people, it's hard to notice people that you don't know before. You're on the same Zooms with the same people. You don't run into the new intern or the new hire or the person you've never seen before. You engage in conversation with him or her, and you find out they have great skills and could be a good part of a new team or a new project. So I'm going to focus on the risks here. Unless we get ourselves into a spot where we're working more closely together, there's a risk that we've created a stasis that we're not going to get out for a long time. Now, I'll tell a quick story. I've been helping run our mass vaccination site at the Armory up at Columbia University. We do about 3,000 vaccinations a day with redeployed people from across our health system. So I've run into nurses and doctors, finance people who are acting as registrars, contract cleaning staff, and IT people who are carrying equipment around. So I've run into people that I'd never met before. And I've taken more resumes in the past 8 weeks from people where I notice them doing a great job. And I say, who are you and what are you doing? And they're telling me, oh, I'm just a contract cleaning person. I'm like, we need great housekeepers in our hospital. Can you send me your resume? And then I'm sending them on to the HR team. So until we get ourselves in a spot where we're bumping into people we don't know, it's going to be really hard for career advancement for a lot of different people.
Yeah, and I would say don't be shy about reaching out to people, because to Daniel's point, you might not run into people at the firm, you know, cocktail parties or the normal things. So don't be afraid to reach out to people. And frankly, people love people that rise to the occasion in a crisis, because, you know, and so if you can be the person who says, hey, let me write you a memo about, you know, some new government program, or, you know, show that you're paying attention to things, and that you can offer to help in some way, that will always make you stand out.
And that's great. And we have one time for just one more question. And Ansuya, would you like to ask?
Yes, hi. So you all touched upon how the pandemic has changed, like how your organizations and industries have changed. So looking in the future, what new opportunities or innovations has the pandemic opened up for all of us, especially for the students?
No, let me just give you my perspective, and Daniel touched on it, and so did Heather, and that is the ability for us to more effectively and efficiently use our data, whether it's to run clinical trials, whether it's to work remote, whether it's to quickly see if we could repurpose a drug for a different use. And so I expect to see data analytics, artificial intelligence. I expect to see that explode. And students are probably in the best position to step into those new opportunities and help in that area. That's one thing that I see. Remote clinical trials, all that relies on data. Drug development from modeling, all that relies on data. So I see that as a huge opportunity for students going forward.
Thank you so much.
And I'll just note on that point, you know, the New York Times, it was either yesterday or today, had a, you know, zip code breakdown of the different COVID variants in New York City and how they've changed over the last few months. And that all comes from big data, right? The fact that we can look at these different variants and then figure out literally at the neighborhood level who has what. I mean, to me, that's just a great intersection of healthcare and information systems.
And that's wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, we have run out of time. I am delighted that we've been able to record this, so please tell your friends and colleagues and associates that this very powerful learning opportunity is going to be available for them to watch later. Heather, Georgia, Daniel, thank you for sharing. Again, this was a very powerful learning opportunity, and we are grateful to you all. We will see all of you soon. I believe, Det, we have a program on Thursday, do we not? Tomorrow?
Yes, we do. We have a company spotlight on Regeneron, which, as you all may know, is a global biotech company, very much aligned with the industry that Georgia represents. For students and anyone who is on the call, please join us, you know, for a very exciting session on the Regeneron way, the organizational work and career opportunities, you know, that are afforded to students. It is from 3:30 p.m. to 5 p.m. And also, we welcome you all to join us for the Seidenberg Innovation Awards, where we will celebrate and honor PACE alum Eileen Mahoney, who is the global CIO for PVH, a very prolific and global fashion and lifestyle company. April 20th, 3:30 to 5 p.m. as well. And if you have questions about any of those events, please email me directly.
Great. Thank you, Det. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you, everybody. That was great.
Thank you.